episode, which is Women in South Africa, an intergenerational conversation, we are going to be talking about what it means to be a woman in South Africa, dealing with gender-based violence on a daily basis, and also the issues that contribute to gender-based violence in general. So I'm going to hand over to our facilitator, Afia, and yeah, kick us off.
Hi everyone, my name is Ifya, and I'll be the facilitator for today. So the title of today's episode is Women Establishing the Root Causes of Gender-Based Violence in Our Society Today. So first I'll hand over to our panelists, according to my screen, and let them introduce themselves. So first, Tarika, please introduce yourself with your name, background, and pronouns, please.
Hi everybody, my name is Tarika Patha. I'm 20 years old. My pronouns are she, her. I started getting involved in anti-GBV efforts in high school when I started an educational nonprofit with a group of my friends, and I'm currently working at an all-femme architecture firm before I go off to college.
Okay, thank you. And Leslie, please introduce yourself.
Hello there. My name is Leslie Wright. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. What can I tell you? I was a teacher for a very, very long time. I've left teaching at the end of last year to pursue other avenues, shall we say. Turns out the avenue I've pursued the most is looking after my baba since the pandemic hit. But yeah, this is something I'm extremely passionate about, amongst a couple of other causes, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Nobu, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Nobu Kosi, she, her, hers, and I have a very loud 4-month-old who may or may not cry during this call. So I have just requested that I stay mostly muted because she's got very beautiful screams around bedtime. I am a human rights advocate. I started and run an NGO in rural KZN on gender-based violence. Yeah, that's basically me.
Thank you. And Tamika? We can't hear you, but you're not muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Better?
Perfect.
Okay, great. All right, hi guys, how are you? Just give me 1 second. Sorry, give me 1 second. I've got a whole bunch of kids running around this house. Okay. Can you please close the door? Okay, so my name is Tamika. I do not have a very fancy GBV background. What I do have, however, is a history of being a huge activist and being quite outspoken on the role of femininity in the world, not necessarily just the role of women. So I'm here today. I have dedicated my 19 years of life, well 18 years of life, sorry, to almost starting conversations wherever I can about the role and rights of women, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Okay, from that we can start. So I'll go through a few questions, and the guests can go back and forth. For questions in the chat, I'll try and link them if we're having relevant conversations about those questions. But if we don't get to them, we will eventually get to them by the end of the webinar. So please do post questions or comments in the chat. Okay, so the first question I had was, for the panelists, and anyone go ahead, what aspect of gender-based violence do you think is more nuanced and misunderstood or misconstrued by the public, and needs to be, a light needs to shine upon that aspect of gender-based violence? Yes, Tarika.
I think it's very important that the discourse around GBV is not simply that someone is an animal or just inherently violent, but I think there needs to be more conversation about the socioeconomic layers in South Africa, because it is incredibly layered in our society. So I think the shift needs to kind of shift away from just kind of demonizing an attacker and actually analyzing why that happens in our society. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can add on to what Tarika was saying, I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that that it is not strangers or monsters or these men out there who are doing these kinds of things, and that it's, you know, it's our brothers, it's our uncles, it's our sons. They're not these you know, hideous, twisted demons out there. They're normal, everyday men walking amongst us.
Thank you. Noble, I think you were going to add something.
Yeah, no, I want to go back to Tarika's point about the socioeconomic aspects and just expand on that and say, actually, I think that something about gender-based violence that I think is super problematic in South Africa is we keep trying to fix just gender-based violence. We don't stop men hitting women or whatever it is that we're trying to put a band-aid over without realizing that actually the problems of corruption in the country are the problems of gender-based violence. The problems of misuse of funds are the problems of gender-based violence, because when you have an NPA, if you have I think 3-4% positive prosecution rate of opened cases, it's super low. I think that's what it was like last year or something, but it could be higher, but it's really low. And the problem with that is you've got NPA that's not well resourced, or the resources going in the wrong direction. So you can talk about we need to prosecute more, but it doesn't matter if if the money is not going in the way that it needs to go. So I think when we look at the gender-based violence, it's such of course suddenly it makes a problem look a lot bigger, harder to solve. It's easier to pick something small that we can solve, but the problem of corruption in South Africa disproportionately affects poor women. Period. Like, it's not the same for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that segues into our question of how South African society and the way it's structured, how do you think it's influenced your experience as a woman, and also how you interact with other women, especially considering the socio-economic differences that are so rampant in our society? Anyone willing to take that question?
Can I?
Oh, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, specifically in regards to how it has affected other women, I think that it has given women a sense of unity, but at the same time, it has given women a position of, and I'm going to speak a lot throughout this discussion about this world that keeps eradicating femininity. It has forced women to suppress their femininity so that we are not as vulnerable. And I think that this has become a position where women are now feeling that they can't be vulnerable, they can't be soft, they can't be gentle, they cannot be women, because we are trying to keep ourselves safe from men. So I think that the way in which that has caused us to relate to each other is we've become a lot more catty, we've become a lot more, I would say, a lot more aggressive towards each other. And I do believe that it's a direct result of gender-based violence. Of course, on the flip side of that, it's brought us a sense of unity. We understand each other a lot better. We protect each other, you know. So I think that it is a double-edged sword.
Can I push you a little on that question? Some people would say that the institution of gender itself and the idea of femininity and masculinity is the actual root cause of these problems. What would you say to that?
All right, so this is something that I wanted to identify with quite early. And that was because I think in this current society, we understand that you don't have to be born with the vagina to be a woman. And so we understand that gender identity doesn't have to exist with people with vaginas alone. And so it can extend to transgender women. And that's why I specifically use the word femininity, because a lot of the times it is feminine people, and feminine doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have to mean kind, it doesn't have to mean anything traditional. It can mean just looking like a woman, because we understand that trans women get they are targeted quite often in terms of GBV. So I would disagree that that is the root cause of it. I think that we've developed very natural ideas of what femininity means. And I think that it extends across genders, it just extends across sexes. So, I mean, we see oftentimes majority of the time that we see even sexual assault in men, it's younger boys. So we're seeing still this gentler idea. And again, it's a feminine idea. Do you know what I'm saying? Women can be part masculine, part feminine. So we're looking at, again, this attack on femininity, this attack on gentleness.
I'd like to pick up off of that. I think when we talk about gender-based violence, I'm very, because I think I work in a rural area, I'm very passionate about making sure that the conversation does not run away from women. And I realize that in this where we are right now as a people, we want to be inclusive, and I agree completely that trans women are part of that conversation. But off the bat, it's very important to know that the attack is on women. Women are disproportionately attacked. Women experience gender-based violence disproportionately to men. And so the aspect of being a woman, being born a woman, puts you at a disadvantage in this world to everybody else. And then identifying as a woman then also places you at a disadvantage than everybody else. But the key thing here is the word, it's about being woman, female, whether you are born with it or you identify as female. And I want that to be clear, because I feel like conversations around gender-based violence, sometimes they get taken over, then women lose their voice in that conversation, because now we spend time trying to, defend the concepts of gender and femininity and the validity of those terms and things like that. And what I like is to say off the bat, being born female or identifying as female is what makes you a target, period. Whether or not it's a social construct, whether or not it's real or it's not, the fact that the world that we live in identifies it, accepts it and acknowledges, and that identification and accepting it makes you a target and makes you vulnerable to the advances, and as she has said carefully, of stronger men, physically stronger people who use their power to oppress, to break, to abuse.
Okay, I'm gonna respond. As I was saying, again, that's why I try to use the term feminine, again, so that it's a little bit more inclusive, and it speaks specifically to women. It's just a little bit more of I'm very careful with my words when it comes to these things, because I don't want anybody to misconstrue me. So I agree exactly with what you're saying. Whether you're born a woman, identify a woman, even if you are a woman in transition at the moment to being a man, you're still at a disadvantage in terms of being exposed to violence. So that is my spectrum of what I'm speaking about here.
Thank you. I'd like to just pick up on what Nobu mentioned about how you said you work in a rural area and that impacts the way you view gender-based violence. I think it's important for us to address the way our history as a country and the political and economic systems that have been perpetrated in this country and how they affect how gender-based violence is experienced by South Africans today. Would anyone like to pick up on that and perhaps also address the nuance? Thank you, Leslie, address the nuance between generations too.
As Noah was talking earlier about how the problems of gender-based violence are the problems of poverty, are the problems of corruption and those presence and histories that we live in. I was just reminded again of how much gender-based violence is also the problems of apartheid and also the problems of colonialism. And so the violence that is colonialism, that was apartheid, is the same violence that is meted out, in this case specifically against women. And those histories of violent masculinities, of patriarchy, which are so steeped into colonialism and other systems of prejudice and discrimination. Yeah, I think those are deeply part of why we find ourselves where we do today.
Yes, Takira.
So working off a bit of what Nobu said and Leslie, I think the interesting thing to sort of think about here is that socioeconomic struggles and racial trauma from sort of a neo-apartheid reality that we're living in, women and men have experienced this. And I think the interesting thing is you don't get women attacking men in the same way you get men attacking women. So I think the crosshairs here is that patriarchy and social and cultural norms come in, and that's when there's a problem, because the combination of socioeconomic struggle, racial trauma, and patriarchy just creates this completely toxic and dangerous environment that I think we're dealing with now. Yeah.
Yes, Nobu.
So I'm going to ask you to just indulge in me, and I'm just going to share with you based on my experience in the area that I work with, and then my socialist side is probably going to come up when I close of talking about how it's actually capitalism. But just to answer the question, is so where I work, it's an area called Etulima, it's in the South Coast. And it's an area that was actually quite famous in the early 90s because there was a lot of the ANC IFP fighting, and there were quite a few people that died. And I believe it's an area where there was significant recruiting of people to join Umkhonto and be ready to take up arms. Now, these arms were never fully taken up, but you had people who were trained to take up arms. You had people who were prepared for war that actually never came. And a couple of years ago, a social worker, it's an informal study, she didn't, publish it in any great papers, but on her own account, when she looked at a lot of the cases of gender-based violence in the area, the men who were beating their wives, who were convicted of rape, the young men in particular, she found that almost all of them, I don't know what the sample size was, but almost all of them were children of men who had been in the armed struggle. That violence was carried across generationally. There's generational violence, there's generational trauma that is passed down. Men who have learned violence as a form of survival teach their sons the same. And we all know what was happening at these liberation camps. We've all heard the stories. We all know the type of sexual violence the women experienced and the type of sexual violence men experienced as well at these camps. And as a country, we never dealt with that. We came to 1994 Rainbow Nation, yay, we're free. I mean, we won't even get into the conversation of how money was released, rehabilitation, and it somehow grew legs and just never quite went where it was meant to go, even as early as the immediate post-apartheid era. So I think that is a big, big problem in the immediate relationships between men and women. South African men left their homes, went to stay in hostels, which were hostile environments that taught them, how to live very strange forms of life. And they took that back home, and it created this twisted society that we have in South Africa. But then I close this off with it's capitalism. Because everything that's wrong with the world is generally capitalism. But in this case, specifically the idea that you are an individual, that neoliberal capitalism, that I am responsible for myself, my actions, it's me, it's me, it's me. We've lost a sense of community. We've lost a sense of, taking care of each other. I'm not going to take up too much time, but if we have time, I'll share with you some of the cultural laws that I've learned from since working here that seem oppressive now, but we're rooted in community to protect women. But in our constitutional era of I'm independent, I'm alone, they don't work anymore. And that deep sense of individualism has separated us from community and allowed men to just be these individual monsters out of a society. They act abnormal to what is norm to society because they don't have a sense of belonging in a society as would naturally be without this neoliberal capitalism that we live in.
Thank you for that. I think from here we can move on to how speaking of apartheid and the policing of women's bodies, how has the apartheid state as a police state in general, that systemic like relationship with the community fell down to the individuals and affected interpersonal relationships? And I wonder, as a society coming out of apartheid, how do we then mend these interpersonal relationships that are based on anxiety, I think, at the root cause? Or if you'd like to characterize that differently. Yes, Tarika.
So Afia, I don't know if I'm going to be able to exactly answer the question, but I want to expand a little bit on the concept of a police state. So I think, and this is a good example, John Forster Square, which used to be the main police station in CBD, in the city, it's now just called Johannesburg Central Police Station. So the issue with that is we kind of just put Black and brown bodies into spaces that were inhabited by white bodies, and I'm talking about the police now. So we look at how police systems work and how in communities the police either are apathetic, especially to poorer communities, or they're not trusted, which I think is a generational thing. And I also think it's because the police system actually has multiple flaws. Another level to this is that the issue, I think, with people's responses and the government responses to GBV is pushing incarceration or pushing sort of a narrative where we need more security, we need more police, we need more cameras. And it simply doesn't work. The system is broken, and I think there's a massive distrust in the police system because it kind of just slipped from an apartheid police system into our modern police system, which I think that's a big issue. There's mistrust because it doesn't work.
Thank you for that characterization. How do you think that then the transitioning from apartheid to South Africa now, how does that affect our interpersonal relationships and affects related directly back to gender-based violence?
Interpersonal between, oh, sorry, Nobu, please.
No, ask your question, Tarika.
Sorry, Afia, I just wanted to confirm, interpersonal between one another or between women?
Between like individuals, women and men, romantic relationships, things like that. How does that affect our like almost personal relationships?
Okay, I'm going to let Nobu answer that.
So I was just going to ask a question. Did we transition from the apartheid state?
Exactly. No.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely a question. Did we would you guys like to take that question? Yes, Tarika.
So particularly if we're speaking about space, because we work, I mean, in the architecture firm that I work at, we speak a lot and we think a lot about space. I think what Nobu's asking is interesting. And I use the term neo-apartheid sometimes because I understand it can be offensive. But if we're looking at spatial apartheid, which I do believe genuinely exists, there is no transition. The fact that Nobu spoke about men who have to go into hostels, or men who are in a migrant labor system, or women who are in a migrant labor system where they're coming into cities and they're traveling early in the morning and stuff, that still exists. That hasn't changed. That's only worsened. So, I mean, what does that say about a democracy? And what does that say about the new South Africa? I don't think it says much at all, to be honest.
I think to add to that, and that's amazing. I like the idea of spatial apartheid because it's so important and we don't talk enough about it, I think. But just to add to that, I think what happened is you had this apartheid state where, you had a minority that had control over all the resources, over the overwhelming majority of the resources. So you ask now, has the situation changed now? Well, no, that minority still has control over all the resources. Okay, do they live in the same areas that they lived in? Oh, yes. Do they still go to the best schools? Yes. So the architecture of apartheid, the things that what made up apartheid, have those things been dismantled? If the answer is no, then apartheid is not gone. And I think that's a really important thing. The only element of apartheid that is visibly gone is the political shift. Then again, you can sit and have conversations with people who know so much more than me about politics. I think Voltaire once said, whoever controls the banks controls the politicians. So who's controlling the banks? who's controlling the politicians, again, as the political system actually effectively changed. And it's important for us to, I think, have a sense of where we are as a nation, politically, socioeconomically. And like I said from the very beginning, and the question that was asked is, gender-based violence is not going to, we can't fix it. It's not a quick fix. We won't be able to solve it alone by putting more Tutuzela centers across the country. That's not going to do away with it. You know, there's deep stuff that has not been dealt with. And I think some of the pain that these men carry, and then they take it out in horrific ways, comes from the socioeconomic state that they live in.
Yeah.
And we don't want to talk about that and acknowledge it. We just, I don't know who said it at the beginning, that we just have made them monsters. You know, they're just these, I think it was Leslie, you know, they're just these monsters over there, but we don't want to recognize that these monsters are our people and what's making them monsters.
Thank you for that. I'm just going on the idea of these men being monsters, and that's the real problem. When we look at news headlines about gender-based violence that report these stories, we respond with, how could someone do that? That's shocking. These men are completely terrible. And I want to, let's try and complicate this conversation by really addressing how race comes into this. Why do some activists want to focus on Black women, for example? Why is that their situation particularly important in this conversation? And the way Black men are also tried to portray by media, when they are usually the ones who in our media reporting are perpetrating this violence. Yes, can someone take that question?
Okay, I'll start, and then I hope somebody will. I just again want to pose something. Historically, in the history of humanity, which race has had an inclination towards raping other races or other people? Such an important question. And then we have to ask, which group of men has historically been vilified and given animalistic qualities and made to seem monsters? Black men. Now, this is not to say that they are not doing the most in South Africa, because they are. And this is not to defend them, but I think it's important to have a very accurate narrative of why the stories appear to be the way they're told. You know, I think that's why. It's just the way it's always been told. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I've had the privilege of studying abroad, and trust me, in countries where it's just white men, they're just as vile and as cruel as our Black men here in South Africa. It's not a race thing. I don't think it's a race thing.
Thank you, Tarika.
I just wanted to add on to what Nobu said, like perfectly put. It's not a race thing. I think it's important. I think the most obvious point, obviously, is that white people are the minority in South Africa, whereas we have a Black and brown majority, which kind of like is one of the most obvious points, and I think just flies over people's heads when they start to dehumanize Black men in South Africa. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Tamika?
Okay, I'm not speaking in regards to Black men at the moment. I'm going to speak on behalf of my own culture here. It's not a race thing. However, there is a very strong cultural influence in this. So I'm going to speak on behalf of Indian men. Specifically in India, we have very, very, very high rape rates going on. And we see, combined with that, very low divorce rates. In fact, I'm pretty sure, if I'm correct, India has the lowest divorce rate in the world, which is a very disturbing idea, because we understand that a lot of rape is happening in these marriages. And when these men, and we see it quite often, when these men try and move to other countries, they're shocked by the idea that their wives have to give consent. And I honestly blame that on a cultural thing. And this is because men, specifically in Indian culture, are often exposed to women who cover up. And so and this is not to say women can't cover up or anything, but then when women are not completely covered up, they feel like they're seeing a naked woman. And that's where I believe that we can't avoid race in the topic that we're looking at here, because race is.
Sorry, we can't hear you. You cut off a little bit.
And she kind of great point. Race is, I'm like, yes, race is.
Right, yeah. Tamika? Okay, does anyone want to pick up on where she was, and we'll try and sort that out in the background?
So I just want to continue with what she's saying, and then she can come in and, you know, say what she's saying. But I think, so just to clarify, to me, the question you asked was about specifically around Black men as the aggressors. And that was my answering the aggressive Black men. Is it just a Black men problem? And that was the answer to that, to say it's not a Black men problem. But yes, like she's saying, that you have to look at different cultural and race aspects, you know, but because she's bringing in an idea that it's Indian in India and it's an Indian culture, this is when I then question, is it a question of race or culture? And what are the subtle differences between race and culture? Because here where I am in deep, heavy Zulu culture, which is very different from the culture that you'll experience in Joburg, right? And so to call it, I wouldn't dare to call Zulu culture Black South African culture. I wouldn't even call the culture of rural KZN Durban culture either, because there's specific cultures to specific localities which don't apply across the racial group.
Okay, I've heard very little, so I'm gonna go with what I've heard for the past like 10 seconds. Sorry, my audio cuts off for some reason. But as I was saying, I'm speaking very specifically about Indian culture, because this has tended to spread across, regardless of whether you are coming from North India or South India. There's a really fundamental culture, and it's quite informed by religion. And there's a couple of things that actually do go into it. Again, it is a very complex conversation, and I'm not going to apply it to South African culture at all. I think I said that in the beginning of what I was saying. But my point ultimately was not that this is the only thing, or that you should look at it in isolated areas, but that it is a factor, and that we can't leave it out of the conversation, because I think people are very scared of being offensive. But you know, if we want to think freely, we have to risk being offensive, and we have to actually look at the factors that make a man do such. We have to look at what it is, what equations we're putting into the variable that keeps producing rapists in our country and in the world. So I don't know if I've actually answered your question, because I don't know what you said, because I don't know what you said. But
no problem. Thank you for that.
Something of use.
Definitely, thank you. Tarika?
So I've got a question for Tamika, and I'm not sure if it's going to be, I think it's going to be quite complex to answer, but I'm just trying to like understand a little bit more. When we're talking about culture and race and being offensive, I think my main question is looking at European culture. If you look at statistics of rape and abuse in Europe now, it's very low in comparison to different parts of the world. But what is European culture? Because Europeans were the same people who colonized and violently colonized many spaces. So I think it's a little bit, when we're speaking about, oh no, race needs to be part of the conversation, I think it's a lot more complex than that, like race and culture. So I think it's hard to kind of like blanket that. So it's not, I don't think people avoid it because of not wanting to cause offense, but I think it's because it is actually very, very complex, and you have to tackle it from multiple angles to actually be able to answer the question effectively.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with what you've said there. Sweden, and specifically Nordic countries, have very high rates of rape. And so we see here that Nordic culture often results in high GBV rates. So when we're looking at it, again, I've said that there's races, but there are subcultures within it. I used Indian culture specifically because, again, Indian culture tends to transcend across these subcultures within it. And so that's why that was my example. But it does go into a very complex idea here. And we do see that, I understand, yes, you're saying that these are people that the culture, it caused for colonization, it caused for general violence. that's not leaving that out of the equation. What we actually need to look at is how has that influenced this? Because I think that a lot of what we leave out of this is anthropology. How exactly did this culture evolve, and to what extent did they develop GBV among their culture? Why did this happen? What was it that occurred at this point? Because we can't look at where we're at if we don't look at the factors. So what I'm trying to look at here is, because culture is just, it's a broader representation of factors. So again, I would disagree with what you're saying that Europe has low GBV rates. It's separated into subcultures. I think that people do avoid it because people are scared of being offensive.
I'd also like to
go ahead, Nobu.
Okay, no, I was just going to say that it's super, just to add to that, Europe is super large as a continent, super small compared to us, but in terms of numbers, there's a lot of people, and rape is not necessarily low everywhere. You've got higher rape in places like Russia. You've got high rape and sexual violence in other countries, Ukraine as well. I can't speak for every country. I also know that GBV is not as low as you think it would be in the Nordic countries as well. So I think, I feel like the best way to explain, I think, how we perceive rape in Europe and rape in Africa, same way, sexual violence in Europe, is the same way we perceive corruption. Like corruption in Europe it's sophisticated. It has that, and it's it's corruption, but it's better than our type of corruption. So with all the crimes, there's sexual violence, there's, horrible things that happen. If you're bored, read the European Court of Human Rights and see what they do to each other. But then we don't see it the same way. And it goes back to the original question of, why is it black men? It just seems worse when it's done by black people. It just seems like the way it's reported, the way it's told, it just seems so much worse.
May I answer this? And it's going to come from a very strange point of view, but hear me out, right? So one thing that I have always been very interested in is the classification of body types, so that I can help women specifically, just become a little bit more tailored, let's put it that way, to themselves, and so they can become a little bit more confident. So there is a stylist who is named Kibber, and he essentially came up with the idea of body types being a representation of essence. So it took into account your hair, your nose, your bone structure, all of these things, right? And we saw that women who were a little bit more lush, and women who had features such as more, softer hair, women that had softer features, women that had like down to details such as, more flesh on the cheekbones, all of these things, women of these sorts were given the yin undercurrent, well, not the yin undercurrent, the yin dominance, and that is this feminine dominance. And so what I think is that I'm not necessarily going to comment on black men here, but I'm going to comment on why black women have been so sexualized, because majority of the time the target of rape in this country specifically is black women. And so we see it from a very young age. We see black girls being sexualized a lot younger than everybody else, but it's because they look a lot more feminine. And so that goes back to my initial point of, what is the attack on femininity? Because we see that despite it being an attack on women, we see that it's a specific attack on femininity. And again, it's expressed through black women. We can see that women who have larger breasts and women who are a lot more curvaceous, and, even if you look in societies, it's still, again, it's normalized if it's a curvy Latina woman. Do you know what I'm saying? We look at cultures where it's women who look, in Kibb's classifications, he calls them the romantics. It's women who look romantic that we have put down, and we have really gone and we've made femininity seem weak. And so it makes sense. It makes sense to overexert a masculinity on these women. And so I think that when black men do it, I don't think that we see them as monsters, but I think that we've assumed that black men are going to do it because we've seen it happen to black women. So I would say that that's the case.
Okay, thank you. I think I'd just like to problematize your characterization of us, perhaps our society attacking femininity when Black women are labeled men, like are not seen as women the way white women are in the society. Perhaps Leslie, would you like to come and comment on how race has affected the relationship or the systemic relationship between Black women and white women, how we face gender as individuals?
I think that both are true, to be honest. I think that that in different spaces and different circumstances, both of those ideas seem to me possible and true. I think that I've certainly been awakened or made aware recently of the vast difference in experience in race. Because certainly growing up, I was never taught explicitly, but there was always the understanding that the Black man was the dangerous man. You know, no one ever warned us about our pastors or our scout troop leaders or whoever it was. It was the monster, the creature waiting to get you from behind the bushes was always a Black man. And I think a friend of mine recently asked on Facebook, at what age was the first time that you was sexualized as a sexual object, even though you were too young to be that. And for myself, that was, I became aware of it probably about 16. And to me, that was, 16 when you, and the answers absolutely shocked me. And I think that what most of the women commenting were Black, because this friend is Black. And it seemed to me that there was a huge disparity in experience from what I experienced, and my experience is not universal, of course, versus what other women in this country were put through as young women.
Thank you. Would anyone want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I'd like to add. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. I'd also just like to query, I think query Tamika's idea that, so I hear what she's saying from an anthropological perspective. I'm not that. I studied law, so I have no idea. It sounds right. Experientially, it's not true. So I can't argue on the validity of what is presented, and it makes a lot of sense. It actually makes good sense. The experience of Black women is that you have women, your famous women like Serena Williams, who is absolutely gorgeous, but she's called a man, and she is attacked for looking like a man. You have even at some point, Beyonce, who is absolutely stunning before she reached weird cult status, was constantly talked down to about her curves and the shape of her body. And the only reason that her body type has become acceptable is because, in my opinion, white men lusted after it long enough for white women to make it okay. And now, it's okay to be curvy. It's okay to have thick lips, big hips, and everything that was offensive about Black and brown women all these years is now a fashion trend statement. I remember first year of university, and I had a white girl. She was a partner for a multi-court competition. I wore, just to see the difference, I wore a dress, and she said to me, I think that dress makes your ass look fat. And I was like, really? Awesome. Thank you, girl. And now she was telling me as like, no, don't wear it. What I heard was, yes, my ass looks big. And so I think only now are those standards of beauty merging and coming in together. But I think even the idea of a standard of beauty is problematic because we're all so different. And at any point in time, when you have a standard of beauty, that which looks different from that standard is going to be, made to feel worse. It's going to be put down. It's not going to be honored as the beautiful creation that it's meant to be. And yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay, may I respond to what you were saying so that I can just clarify again? I'm very, very, very specific with my word choice. The word choice that I used was body types. So it's the actual feminine presence of the body type. The personality might contradict entirely, and the stereotype might contradict entirely. Again, but it's this idea that Black women have been perceived to be, well, I would say gender-based violence is a thing of, it's physical abuse. We're speaking about this. Of course, it extends to emotional abuse. I'm not excluding that entirely. What I'm saying, though, is what I'm speaking about here is a very specific range of actual physical combative violence. And again, I'm talking about the body type and how the body type has evolved, and the body type being feminine, not necessarily that Black women are perceived to be feminine. No, it's that the body type is, and so it has become a lot more acceptable to do so, because I see that it's our biologies are designed to, men's biology is designed to seek out a feminine looking body. And that is, again, for childbirth. That's why you see men specifically going for women with, I think it's 0.7 ratio hips. So we're seeing it like this, and we're looking at what is it that
Sorry,
has...
I'm going to interrupt you, Tamika. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to have to pause you there because I don't know where this is going. But
I'm clarifying my point.
So what I want to stay away from is anything that sounds like it could even remotely possibly provide any understanding or justification on an anthropological, scientific, biological basis for the targeting of any specific body.
I'm not justifying anything, I'm explaining it. I'm trying to explain exactly why it's become not necessarily, we've become desensitized to it happening to Black women. I'm not saying that this is okay. I'm talking about what exactly it was that caused people's mindsets to not think that that's as important as a white woman.
Okay, Tarika, would you like to say something?
Sorry, I think venturing into topics, or at least like speaking about body types or stereotyping specific body types or specific hip sizes is going into a little bit of a strange space, and I'm not sure if I'm like comfortable talking in that space. I'm not sure about like how you guys feel about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask another question. Considering that Leslie and Nobu referenced having children, I wonder what the role that women play in the society as caretakers, and how that relates to the way they're financially compensated, and also the value that their work has in the society, in the society that's so based around the kind of work you do, right? When people say, "What are you?" you're supposed to reply with your occupation. Perhaps let's touch on that. Does anyone want to touch on that topic?
I'll go after you, Leslie. She's only 4 months old.
I can't speak from personal experience on that, because as a queer woman, my relationship is very far from that kind of experience. So I think I probably only have sort of a cultural understanding of what that might be, to be somehow inferior because you work in the home rather than outside the home, and you take care of children, which we all know is, not a particularly important job, and how that might might sort of lead to those women being more exposed to gender-based violence than others.
Thank you, Leslie.
I don't think I have experience to speak on that.
Okay. Can I challenge you that a little bit? Hopefully, I'm not overstepping. But for your occupation as a teacher, I just see like most teachers are women, and those are the people we put in charge of our children. And I just thinking about the people we also put in charge of our elderly, from the Black women in our houses that take care of middle class children, and then the teachers we take them to are Black women again. And then we talk about essential workers in this age, and who are most of those people tend to be low-income Black women. And I just wonder, then, what does care politics in the way that who is taking care of our most needy in society, how does that translate to who is most valued in the society, and how does that relate to gender-based violence?
I think you've hit the link exactly on the head there, which is that a Black woman in this country are devalued on many different levels, and care for other people, as you point out, is not considered real work. It's not considered work worthy of remuneration, or of generous remuneration, and so I think that it feels to me that there's a link there between that kind of position that we put women in and gender-based violence. But again, I'm talking from sort of an outside view here, not from any sort of experience or other people that I know's experience on this. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond or add to that?
So I'm just gonna, I think, so there's something that is important. If you are a Black child here, tell me which of you Black children don't know a woman who has absolutely no income in her life, a Black woman. I'm not talking about formally employed. I'm not talking about degreed and everything like that. So I think the story of Black women and white women in this particular regard is very different. If you, maybe for the younger generation, I'm 30, so it's a different story for me. I didn't grow up knowing a lot of Black stay-at-home moms who were in the middle income area. If she was Black and staying at home, it was because she was unemployed. She was not a stay-at-home mom. She was unemployed. She was in the transition of trying to find a job. She was looking for work. She didn't actively make a choice to stay at home because she had the option of that income. And I think that's when we think about the burdens that Black women carry in terms of the work labor, Black women don't generally just stay at home and look after kids. It's actually not as common as we like to think. They work piece jobs. They work on the street corner. They go and make a plan. They find something during the week. They are not stay-at-home moms. You know, they're not staying at home to look after kids. So that narrative for me personally doesn't really apply to Black women. I don't know a lot of stay-at-home Black moms. I don't know them. I know a lot of unemployed Black women. I know a lot of Black women hustling to make a plan, but I don't know a lot of stay-at-home Black moms. But I will say, to the initial question around, I think for me, motherhood and gender-based violence, the truth is the burden of childbearing always tends to fall on women. And more often than not, which is a very true statistic, by the way, children need fathers. We know that, right? They need that figure. It adds something. Sociologists, psychologists, you know, they've got all these stats. And far too many women stay in really harmful spaces because their minds are always set on their children. A lot of women stay for the children. Even if it beats me up, but at least the children will have. And obviously, because men tend to have higher income, even if they're doing the same work, or if they're doing similar work, they can hustle more because they don't have the burden of children. Women, being a mother it does put you at a higher risk of staying when violence does come, because you start thinking about the children. I have a client here who her partner raped her daughter, and before lockdown she went and reported it, and the case is still going in. You know how long GBV cases take to be processed in South Africa. Now multiply that by 100 to a small rural area where nobody really can fight for their rights. And the process took so long, and when lockdown came, she lost her job as a seasonal worker because there was no holiday makers coming aside, and she had no choice but to either face starving herself and her 2 children, or to go and stay with the boyfriend, who said, "I'll take you back, just drop the charges. I promise I won't touch you again. I'm sorry." And that's that. That's the end of it. She's gone, you know, and of course he's going to, I mean, we know he's not going to stop. That's not how it works. That's not how the world works. But I think, yes, motherhood and poverty place you at a higher risk of staying in really dangerous situations.
Thank you. Yes, Tarika?
Afia, sorry, just before we carry on, I've been waiting to say this. In response to what I said earlier, because I think it's important that I clarify and just like sort this out. I apologize if that came off as ignorance, saying that European countries tend to have less GBV. I did mean, and I didn't say obviously statistically in terms of like ratio. So obviously African countries are bigger. Africa as a continent is bigger than Europe. So I just wanted to confirm that. And I also wanted to say that it was more about the perception of European culture having less rape rates than Indian or African culture. So I just wanted to say that that perception, I think, is wrong if we look at the history. Yeah, just wanted to put that out there before we carry on.
Thank you. I think we've been talking a lot about how gender and gender-based violence manifests on a systemic and institutional level. Perhaps we can move on to then, how do we dismantle this if it's kind of an invisible system? How do we, how do we address it? Yes, Tarika?
So I think circling back to something Nobu said in the very beginning when she touched on corruption, I think I heard recently that there was another corruption scandal in terms of educational supplies not arriving or being stolen from. And I think education is a big part of transformation in South Africa. And when corruption is endemic, it almost is like every time these people or these organizations are stealing money, they're stealing these girls and these women's lives, because ultimately it means there's less security of a welfare state, there's less sort of education. So I think like in terms of actually restructuring governmental structures and actually making sure that certain things are in place, like welfare systems, like education, would be a big start actually to seeing some kind of transformation beginning in South Africa. Yeah.
Maybe someone can expand on this, but why is education and having welfare and the protection of government so important when it comes to gender-based violence? Tiki, you can expand on this, or someone else can take this. Yes, Tiki?
I think this is just one vein of that, because I think there's multiple things to talk about why that's helpful. But for example, educated people, educated kids are more likely to be able to get jobs. They also are more likely to create employment for other people. If you're also looking at a home, for example, where a woman does not have a job and she's relying, like Nobu said, on a man because he has resources, he has a job, he has higher income, what would South Africa look like if women had more jobs, if they had more financial security, if they had access to an education at the very beginning? So I think that's just like one thing to touch on out of the many reasons why that would be helpful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I make a point?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so there's been something that I've been very, I guess, loud about, and that is this idea that the government has a role in providing information and accessibility to birth control methods, and I'll go into it now. So essentially, when we look at the statistics of developing countries, we understand that before the age of 18, 1 in 3 girls will be married. Now, we are a developing country, and that's a very scary statistic. Now, when you look into that even deeper, we understand that between the ages of 13 and 19, well, actually, sorry, it's 15 and 19, the biggest cause of death in girls is childbirth complications. So we see here that this is an unspoken form of GBV, this child marriage, and how not actually investing into information and accessibility to birth control methods is something that the government has failed women in doing. So that's just an example of how the government actually has to get involved in protecting women, because funding is really what we need. At the end of the day, again, I speak a lot about the birth control poll's role in emancipating women. If we look at the 1960s, the birth control poll had a huge role in providing economic freedom to many women. And now what we need is for that sort of revolution to occur for women in developing areas. And really, we are a developing country. So we see that if governments are not actually investing in their women cannot invest in themselves. So that's my take on it there.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add?
Yeah,
Yes,
I can just add. I think, luckily South Africa has gone very far in eradicating things like child marriage and those types of problems. But what we have not done, which Tamika, I completely agree with, is sex ed in schools.
Yeah.
Effective sex ed. It is shocking how this stuff is not done. And all of this is actually quite connected, because when Terika talks about resources, there's a thing in our country that in order to get anything passed through, you have to have a political agenda, you have to know the right people, and activists have been talking about changing our curriculum to make it more inclusive, to make it actually educational for real life. And our sex ed is not working well. I mean, Sweden is a country that, and I'm not one to just use European examples for all the reasons that we can think of, but in this example, they teach children from a very early age. I can't remember what the Swedish phrase is, but there's a thing that they teach them about respecting women. And they did this intentionally as a nation to try and eradicate GBV and to increase equality between men and women. And they do this from a young age. They teach them in schools. And so we need to get our education system right from a young age. Teach them. I mean, I work in, we do trainings at high schools. And if the things that people think, what scares me more is it's not the things that the boys think around consent. It's the things that the girls think around consent. Hence the point of educating the girl child. Because even the girls think that, oh, well, I led him on, therefore it's my fault. And, so many problematic things that the girls themselves think. And I think getting our education system in check needs to definitely be a priority for a generational thing, so that we can save the next generation. But for this current generation, we just need to get our justice system working. I mean, South Africa has really great laws. Can we just you cannot have as low a rate of convictions of rape in a country that has such a shockingly high statistic. I mean, the rate of conviction is, I'm not going to break y'all's hearts with how many clients I have who've just decided to stop pursuing prosecution because it's taken so long. Not because the guy didn't do it, not because the person didn't believe it, but, if my child is raped at the age of 2, I don't want to be going to court when they're now 6, 7. Like, I don't want that for my child. I just want to move on and forget it. And so definitely getting the justice system working well. And like a big technicality for me is divorcing the marriage between the Tutuzela care centers and the NPA. Like, I feel like that is something that really needs to be done. So your Tutuzela care center is where you go to when you've been raped. They offer you the kits, the rape kit, and there's the medical and the social and things like that. But those centers are key to us dealing with rape in South Africa. And you'll always hear government clapping their hands at opening it to delegated, but they're not working well because they're part of the Department of Justice. And I don't think they should be. I think they need to be a separate entity of their own that focus on health and the socio-economic social stuff around having a social worker, therapy and things like that. And that information can be independently given to the prosecutors to handle it in court, but to separate and not keep them married together, because the way in which the system works around statistics and things like that, it's also problematic. And so for me, is the education from a young age and the justice system to just work better.
No, but can I just expand on what you're saying about education from a young age? So I was molested for years as a child, and I think that if I'd known that that was molestation, I would have said something at the time, and maybe I would have had a better chance of actually getting help. But because I didn't know, and because people thought that I was too young to know what sex was, I did not know what had gone on for 6 years. And I think that this is a problem that a significant portion of South Africa is facing, and a significant portion of the world is facing. And in avoiding this conversation of sex in schools, we have girls that are experiencing sexual assault, not knowing that they're experiencing sexual assault, and going their entire lives protecting their rapists. And so I do absolutely agree with you. We need it from a very young age, if not the idea of sex, but the idea of consent. That has to be there from a young age, and girls need to be more informed. I don't understand how we can call it a democratic society if people are making choices which are informed to different degrees. That's not how it works.
Thank you. Tarika, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said. So I think what's interesting to think about is the ALO curriculum right now, I think I would call it pathetic. I remember learning about sex in school, and it's very technical, it's very anatomical. So there's the penis and there's the vagina, but there isn't much detail about sex, consent, and all of these complicated issues that I think I think children need to be learning in a kind of arcing way where it gets more complicated as you get older. And I think Foucault calls that the medical gaze, when you're just learning about anatomical things and taking away the human in it, which I think is a big problem. And exactly what Nobu said, when we're speaking about prevention, I think education comes in strongly within a prevention tactic, and then response. I think response is in dire need of having transformation happen there, because response includes obviously the justice system, and how police stations are just not equipped or do not actually deal with rape cases and abuse cases at all. Actually, they just do not take them on in a way that's professional. So I think looking at prevention and response together, I think is a good way to think about how we can tackle GBV.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that the solutions you propose are societal-based solutions based on long-term goals, whereas I think the solutions politicians offer up now are based on the police system and using the police system to correct men, perhaps. Would anyone like to expound on that? Yes, Rika.
So I think I touched on it briefly about how the government pushes incarceration as a solution to GBV, which I just don't think is a fast solution at all, especially because if you think about what the police and the military mean in different communities. So I think lockdown is a great example of seeing what the military means in the suburbs. So military presence, I heard quite a few suburban kids saying that they felt safer and, rates of violence are down. But if you see footage of the military in townships, they're kicking down people's doors. The way that sort of policing and military presences work in different spaces is an important thing to think about, because I think blanket stating that we need more police, we need more cameras, we need the military, it doesn't actually work for the majority of South Africans.
Yeah. I also just think that rape cases, some of them, very few, obviously, is the example I'm going to give. The legal definition of rape is, a child who's above the age of an adult over 18 years of age, having sex with anyone under the age of 17 would, at the age of 16, would be rape, right? It would be statutory rape. Now, if so, we had a case, a boy is 18, the girl is 14. Now, according to the law, to the black and white letter of the law, that's statutory rape. But so what do you do in situations like that? Do the police just come and arrest him? He's okay, so there's 14, but they were in high school together. They were in a steady relationship. The girl's mother came from outside of the rural area and found this out, and wants the boy arrested. The rest of the community thinks she's crazy because this is the way of children. He's just a child, you know. And I think that the policing of things is clearly a problem. The age, he's much older than the child and at a certain level of maturity than her. But if you come into that community with blunt force, you say arrest him and things like that, they feel there's a delegitimization of the legal system, and we have to be better in how we approach things whilst ensuring that you get justice. Because in as much as we don't, in as much as we like to think that we're individuals, community buy-in is quite important to eradicate gender-based violence. It's really important in the long term. And so I don't have the answer for that case, you know. The police were called and they also arrived and they're like, ish, yeah, you know, and you can, you know, try and make them arrest him, but they'll let him out tomorrow because, you know, and the prosecutors won't be keen. And so how do you handle, I don't have the answers, but how do you handle those types of situations, especially when the politicians just tell you that the solution is arrest people and lock them up, when they themselves, when the current system is failing to do that at all.
Tamika, were you going to say something?
I was gonna ask, are we assuming that an 18-year-old is a child in terms of like sexual development? I just want to know that, I just want to define the terms.
No, they're legally an adult.
Yeah, okay. So I think that, and having read through our sexual assault laws, I think that they're very comprehensive. They are very specific, and there's some variation here and there where you can use it to your advantage. So for example, if you're 17 and 15, you know, there's a Cinderella law that sort of covers you. I don't think that was your point though. I think that was just an anecdote in your point. But look, I don't necessarily think that policing will solve it. I think that we do need to focus on reformation of the society which produces rapists, as I think Tarika is trying to say, that we need to actually focus on the factors that make it happen. As you've said, policing, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword here, because we do want due process. We do want a case where we can actually rely on the outcome of a rape case to be valid and accurate. I think what we do need to have a little bit more of a loophole for is, and I always say this, if somebody came back from the dead and said, this person murdered me, we wouldn't ask them, but are you sure? You know, the murderer would be guilty until proven innocent. And so when we've got rape victims saying, this person raped me, I think that our justice system needs to be a little less focused on proving them guilty and a little bit more focused on actually proving them innocent. Because if we have to go in that regard, very few men would be able to prove themselves innocent. There'd be a lot more incriminating evidence against them, and we could actually get a lot of what we need to do done. But again, as you've said, the problem is it's stuff such as years after a case happened and the report of it. It's stuff such as, I would assume that our justice system is very desensitized to rape. And so what we need to do, I feel, is as a culture, we need to become a lot more sensitized to rape again. And we we need to have an idea that, wow, you know, I don't ever want to undermine due process, but we have to, in the case where a witness is the accuser, it's a matter of you're kind of guilty until proven innocent. We've got a first-hand witness, so that would be my point there. Sorry, I know it's a bit all over the place, but I hope that I've made something.
So I hear you, Tamika. Can I just, obviously this is,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if it's a quick response, Nobu, you can go ahead.
I'm interested because the debate around guilty until, innocent until proven guilty is an interesting one in terms of sexual violence and rape, because people will say, well, no, it should the system works this way to protect people from the power of the state. And once you have a situation where, something to think about, I'm not sure what the answer is, but once you have a situation where certain crimes can be identified by the state as not being worthy of the due process that is given to other crimes, what stops the state from extending it beyond rape? And that's or sexual violence, and that's the slippery slope of innocent until proven guilty. Because is this person going to be incarcerated throughout the trial? Is this person, what does innocent until proven? This debate is not going to answer that question, but this is an interesting thought of, if we go that route, what does that mean for someone?
Okay, my answer to that is I agree. You cannot actually get rid of that without almost putting us on the path towards tyranny. So agreed in that regard, which is why I still said we still do have to protect due process. I was talking more about the treatment of rapists. They're treated, and I'm talking of on a social level. We treat rapists as innocent until they can prove themselves guilty. Again, you can see this when you actually
Sorry,
report it.
Tamika, I'm just going to interrupt you. We do want to keep the conversation going. Tarika, you had something to say?
I have a very quick question for Nobu. So Nobu, as a woman who studied law, I'm curious, I've always thought that a good, or at least I'm spitballing here, a good way to reform the justice system in regards to policing and the way that GBV cases are taken through the justice system. Do you think looking at police stations and sort of investigating, do they have due process? Do they have trauma counselors? Do they have the right kits available? How do the police respond to survivors who come in? Do you think changing police stations is a way to change the justice system, or do you think that wouldn't help?
So when it comes to a rape case, you actually don't need, technically, unless there's no Tutuzela in your area, you don't need to go to a police station. Okay. So South Africa has already put that in place. They've recognized that police stations are not safe spaces for women to go to. Okay. So that's why they are the Tutuzela care centers, which is where you go to, which exactly has the trauma counseling, the health staff, and all the things that you need to get a solid case together. But like I said, those places are still married to the state institution of the NPA, which is very much, the prosecutors are very good friends with the police, because they all work for the state. Now, if you have police, if rape was taken out of the police to protect the victims and make it a more wholesome thing, but you still expect police officers to do their investigations. There's special police units, your units that's existed for that. So I think South Africa has tried to change it, but for me, it all goes down to corruption and resources and political will. So it doesn't matter. You can create 1 million new Tutuzela care centers. You can do whatever you want, but until they are adequately resourced, not with political appointments, not with people who find favor with local, people of authority, cadet deployment and all that stuff, but with experts and people who actually are qualified for the jobs and passionate about the work, and they are resourced and given adequate tools. I mean, a really sad case, my last point, is over COVID-19, we had a case where the mom disappeared with the kid, and we couldn't find her because she'd previously opened a case of rape, and now we're trying to find her. My organization, and we called social workers to say, we can't find this lady, please help us because we're worried about the kids. Can you contact Child Protection Unit to search for them? And they said, oh, we can't, we don't have PPE, so we can't do that for you. Now, if we're sitting here hearing that these children who are now lost to the system can't be found because they have no PPE, but we have billions of PPE scandals running around the country. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nobu.
Thank you for that. I think this is a good place to start wrapping up. Perhaps we can go around with our to our panelists and go through some final remarks or yeah. So Tarika, can you please go first?
I think a final remark maybe would be to think again about men's role in child rearing and how I think that is incredibly important. And just to double back on thinking about what a revolutionized curriculum or education for South African kids could look like. And I think that would just be the last thing I'd like to say. Thank you, everyone, by the way.
Thank you. Leslie?
I really enjoyed that part of the discussion about education, because that's my favorite bugbear, is sex and gender education. And I think that it is up to the teachers in our schools to step up to a large degree, even when there are textbooks which might provide some kind of foundation for sex ed. Teachers in this country are reluctant to teach it. And yeah, if we can come at the problem from home, teaching children the correct names for their body parts, so that no woman ever has to go to the police station and tell them that she was touched on her flower or whatever it might be. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Tamika?
Oh, okay. Thank you for this discussion. It was really interesting. In ending, I think that I would like to encourage everybody to I guess, in the sex ed that we've spoken about, as I agree with Leslie, that I think that's the part that I'm most passionate about, is if you can't find it happening in schools, try and learn as much and learn as accurate and detailed about it as you can, so that you can become a beacon of education, specifically for younger girls, and try take on a mentorship role for as many people as possible.
Thank you. Nobukosi had to leave to attend to her child. But right now I'll hand over to Seba and she'll just go through some housekeeping.
Thank you, Afia. Thank you guys so much for that discussion. We do have a few questions from the chat segment. I do want to start off with one concerning lobola, and it's from Tabila Mashologu, and basically it's, how do you think marriage practices like lobola promote gender-based violence, or do they play a role in engendering accountability to a broader family structure and hence prevent GBV? So putting it out there. Does anyone want to take off? No?
Can I suggest that we also extend this to our guests who are watching this? Perhaps anyone who would like to answer this question?
Any commentary? There you go, Sharika. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to first off say that I don't think I can 100% delve into the cultural aspects of that because of who I am. I am mixed, for example. I have a white mother, so to a certain extent I have white privilege, and I grew up in a home that has no specific cultural norms. So I'm just going to say, in response to lobola, touching lightly on it, it seems to be kind of, if you kind of have a bride price, what does that mean if you kind of analyze it? Because are you paying for a woman, and does the lobola increase if she's educated, for example? So it's kind of in a way it seems objectifying, but that is my opinion on it, and I don't think I can analyze it any further based on who I am and like my position. So yeah, I'd just like to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on Lobola?
I was going to say, yeah, the same thing as Tarika. I don't think that I'm qualified to to comment on it, because I don't understand the nuances of how those family relationships and the couples relationships might work. Again, from a distance, from on the surface, the exchange of money or items which have value in exchange for a woman seems problematic to me. But there's undoubtedly lots of things I don't understand.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I think that is it for all of us here. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking out your time. You know, schedules are hectic, but yeah, thank you. This was so insightful, not only for me, but I'm sure for more viewers out there. And yeah, I want to wish you all a good night and a happy Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.